Welcome to Wisdom Unveiled.
And just a reminder, before we begin this deep dive, draws on translated conversations with Iranian philosophers like Dr. Dinani and Dr. Larijani. Some concepts or nuances might not translate perfectly. We appreciate your understanding if there are any discrepancies.
Right. So today we're really getting into the thought of the, well, truly brilliant Islamic scholar Khajeh Nasir Tusi. We're focusing on his understanding of pleasure, lezzat, and how it's deeply connected to knowledge, or ilm.
And our source material here comes from some fascinating discussions featuring contemporary Iranian philosophers reflecting on Tusi's work, particularly from the Marifat program. This is actually part 6 in our exploration of Tusi's insights.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What exactly is lezzat, pleasure, according to this perspective?
Well, echoing thinkers like Avicenna, whom Tusi engaged with deeply, lezzat is defined as the experience of perceiving and also attaining, something that the one perceiving considers to be good.
Perceiving and attaining. Okay, so it's not just noticing something nice, it's actually getting it, in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really crucial, and comes through in these discussions on Tusi, is that pleasure isn't monolithic. It's not just one feeling.
You mean like different kinds?
Precisely. Each faculty, we have our senses, our imagination, our intellect. Each one has its own specific kind of pleasure, its own unique delight.
Ah, okay. So the pleasure my eyes get from, say, seeing a beautiful sunset
Is fundamentally different from the pleasure your ears get hearing, beautiful music.
or the pleasure the mind gets from finally understanding a really complex idea.
Absolutely. Different faculties, different modes of fulfillment, different lazat. It's quite a diverse landscape.
That makes sense. And then how does ilm, knowledge, fit in? Is it just the opposite?
In this specific contrast, yes. Knowledge ilm is framed as the attainment of what the perceiver considers not good or even harmful. It's the counterpart to pleasure in that sense.
Interesting. So perception seems key here. You mentioned idrak.
Yes, idrak, perception. The reflections on Tusi really emphasize that lezzat, pleasure, is fundamentally rooted in idrak.
So you can't have pleasure without perception first.
Pretty much. And here's the fascinating connection. Idrak itself, perception, is presented as a form of ilm, a form of knowledge in its broadest possible sense.
Okay, hang on. Perception is knowledge. How does that work? I thought knowledge was more about, facts and understanding.
Well, think about the range of perception. Idrak covers everything from the most basic sensory input, touching something soft or rough, seeing colors, hearing sounds, smelling, tasting.
Right, the 5 senses.
All the way up to using your imagination to picture something, to visualize.
Yeah.
And then even further to the intellect grasping universal concepts, abstract ideas.
So from feeling the texture of wood to understanding the concept of justice, that's all idrak.
In this framework, yes. The core idea is that we as humans are inherently perceivers of meaning, whether that meaning is tied to a specific tangible object or it's a universal abstract principle. We are constantly engaged in this act of idrak, of perceiving.
Okay. That connects to another point mentioned in the discussions, this intertwining of the sensible and the intelligible, masus and makul.
Exactly. Masusat, sensible things, and makwat, intelligible realities. The idea explored through Tusi is that the things we perceive with our senses, the makwasasat, aren't just random bits of data. They're actually manifestations, reflections, you could say.
From manifestations of what?
Of deeper, intelligible realities, the makwat. Think about seeing a specific person. Let's call him Hassan.
Okay.
You see his particular features, height, the clothes he's wearing. Those are all sensible details, masusat. But underlying that particular individual is the universal concept of humanity.
Ah, the intelligible reality.
Yes, that universal essence humanity, which is an intelligible concept, makwa, is actually embodied in that particular person, Hassan.
So our everyday experiences, which are always specific and particular,
are constantly pointing towards or revealing these underlying universal principles or essences.
That's quite different from, say, Plato's idea, isn't it? Didn't he think the universals were in some separate world?
It is different. And the discussions highlight that Tusi, following Avicenna here, diverges from Plato. Plato saw the particulars as mere shadows of perfect forms existing in a separate intellectual realm.
Right, the world of forms.
But Avicenna and Tusi, in this line of thought, argued that, no, the universals exist within the sensible world. They are made manifest through the particulars we encounter. The intelligible shines through the sensible.
So the beauty I see in a specific painting isn't just a shadow of beauty itself. It is beauty manifested in that particular way.
That's the idea. It participates in and reveals that deeper, intelligible reality of beauty.
Wow, okay. That reframes how you might think about everyday experience. So bringing this back to pleasure, Lazat, how does understanding perception and this sensible, intelligible link help?
Well, remember, pleasure arises when a faculty perceives and attains something it finds good and, importantly, suitable to its nature.
Suitable. Okay, but that raises a question, doesn't it? How does my eye know that seeing a beautiful landscape is suitable for it? How does my mind know that understanding a concept is suitable?
Excellent question. This leads us to the concept of innate recognition, or perhaps better put, an inherent awareness within the soul, the nafs.
Innate recognition, like we're pre-programmed.
Not exactly pre-programmed with specifics, but the idea, drawing from Avicenna and relevant to Tusi, involves what's called ilm-i-huzuri, presential knowledge.
Presential knowledge.
It's a direct, non-conceptual awareness the soul has of itself. Think about your own consciousness right now. You know you exist, you're aware of being aware, right?
Yeah. I don't need to read a book to know I'm conscious.
Exactly. You don't need external proof or sensory input for that fundamental self-awareness. That's a kind of ilm-i-huzuri. Avicenna's famous flying man thought experiment touches on this.
Oh, the man suspended in a void, sometimes mistakenly called Birdman.
Right, that one. Even without any sensory input, completely isolated, Avicenna argued, the person would still be aware of their own I-ness, their existence, that self-presence is a form of knowledge.
Okay, so we have this fundamental self-awareness. How does that help us recognize what's pleasurable?
Because this inherent awareness provides a kind of baseline, a reference point. As the soul, through its faculties, senses, intellect, interacts with the world, it can recognize what resonates with its own being, what is harmonious with its nature.
It's like recognizing a familiar tune. Something just clicks.
Sort of, yes. It recognizes suitability,
Yeah.
harmony, and that recognition, that attainment of what is suitable and harmonious is the experience of pleasure for that faculty.
So pleasure is finding what fits our nature, and we know what fits because of this deep, inherent self-awareness.
That's a good way to put it. And some related discussions, perhaps drawing on even earlier Pythagorean ideas, sometimes suggest the soul might recall a primordial harmony from a higher existence, and earthly pleasures are echoes of that. But that's maybe a step beyond Tusi's core point here.
Still fascinating. But Tusi also warns about getting too caught up in certain kinds of pleasure, doesn't he? Specifically bodily ones.
He does. This is a really important practical point highlighted in the reflections. Khajeh Nasir al-Din Tusi argues that excessive engagement, maybe even overindulgence, in bodily or sensory pleasures can actually hinder, can block our ability to attain intellectual pleasures.
Why? Because we only have so much attention to go around.
Pretty much. Humans are finite beings. Our energy, our focus, our time, they're limited. If you're constantly preoccupied with satisfying immediate sensory desires,
You don't have the mental space or energy left to cultivate your intellect.
exactly. Over-focusing on one area leads to neglecting others. Tusi suggests that deep preoccupation with the pleasures of the body can distract from and even prevent the development of our intellectual capacities.
So it's not that sensory pleasure is bad in itself, but that obsession with it prevents us from experiencing potentially deeper, more meaningful intellectual joys.
Precisely. The discussions draw a contrast. Think of someone totally engrossed in chasing the next sensory thrill versus someone who actively cultivates their mind, who engages in learning and contemplation. Tusi's perspective suggests the intellectual pleasures become far more profound, more satisfying, more lasting when the constant pull of sensory distraction is managed.
It's about balance then, and maybe prioritizing the development of our higher faculties.
You could certainly interpret it that way. It's about recognizing the different kinds of pleasure and potentially aiming for those associated with our more uniquely human capacities, like reason and understanding.
This idea of moving beyond or managing worldly attachments sounds like it connects to broader themes of spiritual development, too.
That definitely does. While maybe not the main focus of this specific discussion on pleasure and knowledge, the idea of detachment from excessive worldly desire is a classic theme in spiritual traditions. Freeing oneself from the constant demand of the senses can open up space for, well, higher realities, deeper understanding, a different kind of fulfillment.
You sometimes hear references maybe related to martyrdom or profound spiritual states about longing for something beyond this sensory world.
Yes, exactly. There are sayings, for instance, attributed to Imam Ali, peace be upon him, expressing a longing for death, understood not as annihilation, but as a transition, a release to the divine that surpasses even a baby's longing for its mother. It points to a reality perceived as vastly more desirable than earthly life.
A transformation from the sensory world to something else.
Perhaps from the realm of shadows and particulars to the realm of light and universals, from relative ignorance to greater knowledge. It's a profound shift in perspective, seeing beyond the immediate.
Okay. One last major topic covered in these reflections is about seeking knowledge itself. Can we actually seek something we know absolutely nothing about? The mash'ul mutlaq, the absolute unknown?
Ah, yes, a classic philosophical question. The argument presented, supported by Tusi and others, is essentially, no, you cannot seek the absolutely unknown.
Why not?
Because the very act of seeking, of desiring, implies you have some concept, however general or vague, of what you were looking for. There has to be an initial hook, some initial understanding.
Like, I can't look for flump if I have zero idea what flump could possibly be.
Exactly. You need at least a general category like I'm looking for something to solve this problem,
Right.
or I'm seeking truth. There's an initial, albeit maybe obscure, object for the seeking mind.
So you can't be motivated to find something you're completely unaware of?
Right. This is contrasted, of course, with God, who possesses absolute knowledge and thus doesn't seek in the human sense. And it's also contrasted with a state of absolute ignorance, where someone is so unaware they don't even know that they don't know, and thus have no impulse to seek.
So the human condition of learning and seeking knowledge exists in that middle ground, between absolute knowledge and absolute ignorance.
Precisely. The pursuit of knowledge happens when we have some initial understanding, some awareness of an unknown, and the goal is to move from that general, perhaps confused state towards a more detailed, clearer, more specific understanding, from obscurity to clarity.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So let's try and quickly recap the main threads from Tusi we've touched on today.
Sure.
Pleasure, Lazat, is perceiving and attaining what's seen as good and suitable for a faculty. Perception, idrak, is fundamental to pleasure and is itself a broad form of knowledge.
And the sensible things we perceive, masusat, are manifestations of deeper, intelligible realities, maklat. Universals exist within particulars.
Right. And we recognize what's suitable or pleasurable partly because our soul, nafs, has an inherent self-awareness, Huzuri.
Yes, but Tusi also cautions that overindulgence in sensory pleasures can limit our capacity for the arguably deeper intellectual pleasures.
And finally, we can't seek the absolutely unknown. Seeking knowledge implies moving from a general awareness towards greater clarity.
That covers the main points from our discussion today, drawing on those reflections on Tusi.
So, considering all this, drawing from Khajeh Nasir al-Din Tusi's perspective, here's something for you, the listener, to think about.
If you really consider these different levels of pleasure, the immediate sensory ones, the imaginative ones, the profound intellectual ones, how might understanding this hierarchy, or maybe just this diversity, influence the way you choose to spend your time and energy?
Yeah, how might it shape what you pursue and ultimately how you define a fulfilling life for yourself?
It's definitely food for thought.
Indeed. And our next deep dive will continue exploring related ideas, perhaps touching more on the connection between pleasure and long-term happiness, or sadat.
We hope you'll join us then.
Thank you for joining us today on this exploration of Khajeh Nasir al-Din Tusi's wisdom.
Until next time, may your own search for understanding be both insightful and, well, pleasurable in the truest sense.
This has been Wisdom Unveiled.